Excellent. Okay. On Monday, when we looked at book 3, I was drawing everyone's attention to something that I think is very puzzling in the structure of book 3, where your prompt is drawn from. And that is, quite simply, that from the premise here, the soul is mortal, you would draw a conclusion that death is nothing to us. Maybe already you see why that's puzzling, just at a first glance. It might seem that, rather, if the soul is mortal, shouldn't it be the case that death actually is a lot to us? Final, absolute. The curtains are drawn, nothing is left, the end of the story. So it's a puzzling argument. It should give you pause for reflection, how you get from the premise, the soul is mortal, to the conclusion, death is nothing to us. Like he says at book 3, line 830. That's the beginning of your prompt for the final paper. So today, what I want to do is look at the structure of De Rerum Natura, book 3. Look at some of the ways that is set up. Okay? So I can sort of, I hope, draw your attention to what makes this puzzling, what makes this interesting. First thing he does, of course, is sort of try to set out what the soul is. Anima in Latin. And that is, it has two parts, he says. One is the spirit, as he calls it, spiritus, and one is the mind, mens. So he's distinguishing between, and we talked about this Monday, sensation and thought or emotion, and the seat of sensation and the seat of thought and emotion. And he's not the first one to try to break down the soul into several faculties. We talked about Aristotle very briefly. You can see this in Aristotle's work, De Anima. It's a very interesting line of thought here. You might take issue with, and he attempts, in any case, to establish that we can distinguish between brute sensation, feeling, and then something with an added cognitive component that is seated in the mind. That's, of course, it should indeed invite reflection as well. And we'll look at that more. But I think what's really interesting is to try to understand how he, as it were, grounds the premise. The soul is mortal. And the way I think that we can think about that is as in terms of the idea, the claim. I think this is what he's after. We'll look at a text in a moment that shows that the soul is subject to the same set of rules, parentheses here, about life and death as the body. Okay? What is true of the body regarding life and death, or mortality, is true of the soul as well. And this in turn is a direct consequence of his basic commitment in book 1 and book 2 that we already saw to something we've called atomism, right? The idea being that the body, in this case the human body, the soul, right, the seat of the spirit and the mind, both of these two things, like everything else, like all the rest, are material. They are composed of atoms. Same set of rules governs the mind and, the soul and the body, because at the ground level, it's the same, made up of the same stuff. Matter. Atoms. Now, he does tell us in Book 3 that the kinds of atoms which compose the soul are rather interesting and peculiar. They're really small, really round, really fast-moving, and thus the apparent immateriality of the soul. But fundamentally, they are but atoms, and thus they're subject to the same rules. So I've said here, and you can see, we can talk about that as his materialism. This is materialism, or here, naturalism. One set of rules for nature, for all natural things. Right? Nature gives us what Lucretius has attempted to show. Nature gives us atoms. The source of all production, all creativity, all life are these little fundamental particles. Outside of that, there's the void. There's nothingness. So for something to exist, it already must be material. Okay? So whatever set of rules is true of the body, such as we already saw in Book 2, about how it's composed and can decompose, is subject to the wear and tear of other atoms colliding with it, forming new compositions, right? Part of this cycle of life he talks about. Is also true of the soul. Another way you can think about this is as a kind of anti-providentialism. As in, we're not special. The human soul, the seat of sensation and thought, it's not special. Nature isn't set up in a way that we get a pass. We don't die the way everything else does. That's not how he sees it. It's all the same story. And there's no arrangement or providence. There's no deity here that would take a concern for us. We've already seen Epicurus' views on the gods. Lucretius here telling us at the beginning of Book 3, they're distant, they're unbothered, they're untroubled. We aspire to be like them. We aspire to be at peace, calm, inner calm. That's the Epicurean ideal, right? This sense of balance and poise. Well, consequence of that is they're not going to oversee things so that some outcome we like will result. We're not going to oversee things so that everything else appears to perish, yet our soul is promised eternal redemption. Do you see how that connects?
Can you explain that again?
The notion of providence? Sure, of course. Maybe I can elaborate on it in context. In the Abrahamic tradition, for example, nature as a whole is not sort of ungoverned and lawless. There is a direction to things, a purpose to things. And one of the ways that we think about that is in terms of the promise of redemption, the promise of some form of immortality, right? Some kind of negation of death as absolute and ultimate. Well, here that doesn't work. There's no story like that here. There's no sort of.
Sorry, I'm late.
Good to see you. There's no sort of, how do I say, exception to the rule, right? This is the theological, what I'm suggesting, the theological kind of angle from which we can think about his materialism and naturalism when it comes to the issue of mortality of the soul. Right? The fact that nature sort of doesn't have an outside acting on it, like a creator agent, a beneficent God. Right, here is relevant because one of the ways that you might think traditionally death is seen as not final is in terms of sort of the possibility that, at the end of the day, it all works itself out for the benefit of the soul, and which lasts forever, despite the apparent chaos and sort of recreation and destruction and recreation of everything else, all bodies. But maybe the theological component here is only tangentially relevant. I think the fact that he opens Book 3 with a discussion of the gods is interesting, however. And I'm just trying to kind of draw on that, those opening paragraphs of Book 3. Why begin Book 3 with a talk of the gods and being absent, being distant, being unconcerned? Regardless, the materialism here, the naturalism here, is really what you need to be kind of attuned to. Right? Book 3 truly is set up by books 1 and 2. There is a structure to the text. There is a process by which he arrives at this claim, this what is here a premise to the whole of Book 3. The soul is mortal. Now, if you look at Book 3, of course, he gives you many different arguments for the mortality of the soul. He objects against some things. I thought they're very interesting. One of those, I think we talked about Monday. One of my favorites there. Right, the mind must die with the body, seeing that it is born, develops, and declines with it. That's in table of contents, page 66, on lines 445 and 458 of Book 3. That's interesting because it's this notion here that I'm talking about of naturalism. Right, there's one set of rules. Nature plays by one set of rules. And sort of just things are born, grow, decline, and die. And that's true because of the way that atoms are. They come together, form some composition, reach some sort of, this might be something of an Aristotelian influence on Epicurus. We talked about perfection in Aristotle when we did the moral philosophy of Aristotle, right? Reach some sort of higher form of themselves, perfect themselves, right? What was the current talk that we had? Manifest themselves in some higher way. Decline, and then, due to subject to outside forces, return to this original state of sort of disparate atoms. Nothing's promised there. You might think, in fact, sometimes things just go straight from birth to death without the intervening growth and decline. And that would, again, be because just nature is non-providential. It doesn't see to it that anything has to go through a certain path. Perhaps. Lucretius seems a little bit hesitant on this point, actually. But it is a very interesting sort of articulation, I think, that passage. Lines 445 to 458 of something like his naturalism at work as an argument for the soul is mortal. So we could look at that if you like. It's quite nice. Why don't we look at that, and then after we look at that, we can look at this here, which is very important, which is one of the best arguments he gives for the materiality of the mind. So we have two different arguments I want to look at. First, I want to look at this argument for the mortality of the soul, the mortality of the mind, and then I'll look at the argument for the materiality of the mind, which is actually a little earlier in the text. So actually, why don't we do that one first? Okay, and then we'll look at the other one, okay? We're going to look at this one first. I drew it out here for you all so you could see it. Okay. Page 72, line 162. Okay, so go ahead and turn to that. Do you all see that in front of you? The same method of argument. Do you see that line right there? Yeah? This is what we were just looking at earlier, Isabel.
Yes, I'm actually reading that page right now. I'm just making some notes.
Oh, good, good, good. I'm eager to hear what you think. So, it's a very interesting argument because we saw an argument like this when we were reading Plato, if you recall. Oh, way back in the day when we were reading the Euthyphro dialogue. Do you remember? Eons past. And we saw the reductio ad absurdum argument. Well, this is one of those too, actually. He will argue that the mind must be material because the opposing view that the mind is immaterial is, strictly speaking, incomprehensible and absurd. He does it in a very peculiar way, but I can show you how it works, I think, without too much difficulty. Let's look at the passage first. The same method of argument, so we're on page 72, line 162. The same method of argument teaches us that the mind and spirit have a material nature. For it is an observable fact that they impel the limbs, the mind and spirit, thought and sensation. Impel the limbs, wrench the body from sleep, transform the countenance, the posture, and pilot and steer the whole person. Right? So they exercise some kind of, here I've written that as the mind, like the spirit, exercises some kind of causal action or control over the body. Pilots it, right? Rouses it from sleep, moves it in some fashion. You can stand on one foot. It's observable, he says. There's the evidence. Okay. And since we perceive that all these operations imply touch, that's the tricky part here. Since all of these operations, all of these instances of the mind acting on the body imply touch or contact. And touch, in its turn, implies matter, because presumably for one thing to touch another thing or to come into contact with it presupposes the fact that they both share in some kind of material nature. For one thing to touch with another means that it has to be material as much as the thing it's touching is material. Are we not bound to acknowledge that the mind and spirit consist of material substance? Okay, so this is how it's supposed to work. Inversely, if the mind were immaterial, he's asking us, how could it exercise any causal action over a material body? How could it exercise any power over it? How could it do anything to it? It would have to touch it for it to affect any change in it. But for it to touch it, it would have to be material. It would have to be material for it to be able to exercise power over a material thing. For it to come into contact with it, to impel certain motion to it, to rouse it, as he says, pilot it. Therefore, it is absurd to think that anything immaterial could be, the mind could be anything immaterial. It has to be material because it's causing changes in material things. It's touching them. It's colliding with them. It's in contact with them. It is capable of acting on them. It is endowed with that power. We see it around us. Now you might think, well, Lucretius, how strong is the evidence, first of all, that the mind here, the spirit, are doing the kind of work you're saying they're doing? You might also draw an opposite conclusion. You might think, well, the fact that an immaterial thing can't act on a material thing, perhaps we should reach the conclusion that the body is also immaterial. Not that the mind is material, but that the body is immaterial. And that all there are immaterial things. And that body is an illusion in some way. Now, that is not the conclusion he draws, but it has been drawn, in a sense. Berkeley, the idealist, says something to that effect. Bodies are actually just ideas in the mind. But he goes the other direction here and rejects this idea that an immaterial mind could exist by virtue of the fact that we see the mind affect changes in material things, thus it must be material, as with everything else. Okay? So that's one of the more how do I say recognizable philosophical approaches to the problem of mind-body interaction. These famous mind-body problem. Okay? The famous mind-body problem. How can an immaterial thing do something to something material or physical? How can the mind and the body interact? Well, the answer he's giving us is, guess what? The mind is not immaterial. That's how. It's an illusion to think it's immaterial. It's made up of atoms, really little, round, fast-moving ones, but they're atoms. They're bodies, and everything is bodily in nature. Difficult text indeed. Questions? Thoughts? Puzzled, perhaps? Yes, 2 questions. And go ahead, Andrika.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't necessarily agree with that, because although I understand what you're explaining to us, it still doesn't really entirely make sense to me, because he's like, oh, well, you have to touch things, right? That's what he's saying, but the mind is your mind. So what are you touching? You know what I mean?
In this case, I think the idea is he's saying he doesn't have the, how do I say?
Like it's not tangible. Like you're not like tangibly like physically touching it.
Yes. I think the word touch here is I would like to look at the Latin, but I think the word touch here is a placeholder for contact of any kind. So if you think, for example, of the activity, brain activity, the way that the brain is capable of communicating.
So a frequency can be a touch?
Well, if there's some, for example, the electrical chemical impulses given over by the brain that go through the synapses that then are carried to nerves to communicate, to carry information. There's a kind of sequence of material things touching each other. There's a kind of cascade of contacts, right? Like, so the mind, in his view, maybe is something like that. Like a seat where this impulse arises. Now, he doesn't give us much information about how that happens. And we know it has something to do with the clinamen. That's a problem we had with Isabel earlier. It's very confusing, that story of the clinamen. We're still kind of puzzled about it. But in some manner, it's like the mind is yes, literally touching the toe. Indirectly, of course. That transmission process requires a lot of little motions and chemicals and electricity, and I'm no neuroscientist, so this is far beyond my comprehension. But I think this is kind of what he's gesturing to. And when he talks about the sort of mind touching the body and touch implying matter, what he's saying is something like that. Like, for there to have been a possibility that the mind moves the body, it has to, like, at some place, somehow, quite literally come into contact with it. Now, that can happen through all these little sinewy places that are microscopic, that we can't perceive with the naked eye. But there's a kind of communication of motion or movement of matter that's happening. And, until that message is sent and then sent back. Picked my toe, I feel pain. This happens extremely fast. But there is a kind of communication happening. That almost raises as many problems as it resolves for the mind-body problem, you might say, because we're still left with the feeling that, okay, you've given me a story about how matter is kind of touching other parts of matter, and fine, but it does feel like there's something truly, as you said, I think quite right, intangible to the nature of a thought as such, right? Something just conceptual, just available to the mind alone. Isobel had a question about dreams, very similar. He talks about dreams. He talks about thought. In book 4, which we won't have time to read together, but clearly he perceived that there would be a difficulty here, in a sense. Like when we get to the really, really strictly mental stuff, not maybe mere nerve impulses and the like, but something really that seems like only the mind can have access to. How does the system work? How can he account for that? So you may want to look at book 4 and see what he says there for more, a more fleshed out picture. Owen, you had a question?
Yeah, I had a similar question because, the way I thought of it was like, I went where you went with like synapses and like, if the mind is material, it's like, I'm thinking of like the brain and the way the brain communicates with the body. But then I also think of like, well, if the mind is material and these thoughts are and these thoughts are being thought of now, and these messages are like messages that are physical and that are tangible technically because they're energy happening at a very small scale, like in your brain. But like then I think of ideas and like thoughts. You said like there's something uniquely intangible about a thought, but the way a thought is communicated is always physical. It's always through sensation. You read something, you hear something. It's a frequency.
Fascinating.
In your ear. So it's like my thought was immediately like, well, then nothing is really immaterial. You can find a way to explain the existence of anything within the thing that it exists in. Like a thought exists as a firing of energy within your brain. An idea exists as writing on a paper or as a sound frequency coming into your ear that you can understand through language. Like,
I mean, yeah, that's the conclusion. That's the direction that Lucretius is sort of pushing us towards, right? His materialism is pushing us in that direction. But I would agree with what you said in the first place, and I think that's where the reluctance on our part might lie. It does look like the meaning of a thought, the semantic content. Sometimes is how we talk about that in philosophy. Is not just. It's a category mistake to try to talk about it in terms of it being material. It just doesn't make any sense anymore. Of course, we're really far from Lucretius now because he clearly doesn't take us to the 21st century. Yeah. But I want you to at least understand where he's gesturing to and where the problems, where our resistance might lie, rightly. Did you have a question? Someone perhaps wearing a Loyola sweatshirt? Yes?
Can you explain what would be the justification of like the mind being, or like what would make it immaterial from like Lucretius's point?
What would make it immaterial?
Like, because he says like, it sympathizes with the body, right?
It sympathizes with the body.
Yes.
Where's that nice line? Thank you. Let's find that. Let's find that here. That's a really nice. That's a really. Where's my pen? That's a nice.
Do you want a pen?
I do want a pen. Well, don't throw it at me. Hold on, I do have a pen. Don't worry.
It's I think
Yeah.
169. It's right above
169.
on page 72. Moreover.
Oh, right. This is nice. Let's look at that paragraph together. Thank you. Moreover, you notice that the mind suffers in concert with the body and sympathizes with it. That's a nice term. It's really evocative. Excuse me?
Yeah, you'd assume if it doesn't sympathize, doesn't take into account like the connection between like emotions and stuff, then it would be immaterial. Because he's saying that since if emotions are connected, since you can feel the pain, you're aware of the pain, it's material.
I think that's the idea. Let's finish the paragraph. Yeah. Even if a spear fails to strike the vitals when it is driven into the body with quivering force and severs bones and sinews, it induces faintness and a blissful sinking to the ground. and on the ground a dizziness of mind, and now and then a vacillating inclination to rise up again. So the mind must have a material nature, since it is affected by the painful blows of material spears. Yeah, that's very interesting. That's a very interesting passage indeed. Yeah, I think you said it rightly. The fact that here, well, which is quite peculiar actually, is that he's talking about the mind when it feels like he should be talking about the spirit, since he's talking about sensation. Bracketing that concern, it is very puzzling because it seems like, well, it is very interesting because it seems like what he's saying is that were the soul immaterial, it would simply be indifferent to what happens to the body, but it sort of feels with it, goes through it with it. This is back to what he said earlier about how the body and the spirit, the soul, is like commingled with the whole of the body. A few paragraphs earlier. I know we're almost out of time. I just want to draw your attention to one more passage that I said we'd look at. This is on 445, line 445, everyone. I want to look at this real quickly. It's important. Are you ready? One more passage. Deep breath. Stretch. Okay, look at this one with me. Page 79. Moreover, we are aware that the mind is born with the body. This is what I was alluding to earlier when I was talking about his naturalism. Develops with it and declines with it. A toddling child possesses a feeble intellect that matches the weakness and delicacy of its body. Then, when maturity is attained and strength is robust, perfection in some sense, judgment and mental power are correspondingly more fully developed. Right? And he's saying it's not an accident that these two things go hand in hand. Later, when the body is shaken by the stern strength of time and the frame droops with forces dulled, alas, old age awaits you all. The intellect halts, the tongue raves, the mind staggers, something like what we used to call dementia, right? Or senility. Everything fades and fails at once. So it is natural to infer that the substance of the spirit, too, is all dissolved like smoke into the breezy air aloft, since we observe that it is born with the body, develops with it, and as I have shown, succumbs with it to the stress and strain of age. Very interesting. It sounds like one of those things we'd like to hear more about, in my view. But the idea there is, I think we already said this on Monday, why should death be the exception to the rule? Why should it be the case that the mind or the soul or the spirit, he's a little bit careless with his vocabulary, which should give us pause for reflection, but why should it be the case that the soul both is born, grows, and declines, but doesn't have that last sort of correspondence with what we see the body going through? Why would that be the exception to the rule? It's actually a very good question. Well, on this puzzling note, I wish you all a lovely evening. I will see you very shortly.
Now I've got more.
Ah. See ya. See ya.